Good morning, David. How you doing?
Doing great.
I'm excited to have you on the show. I know we had lunch and you haven't told the story on a public platform. I don't think like this, but you sat through one of our boot camps last week, and you've just got so many different dynamics to your story, from the different exits and how you grew. And I don't know, I swear you could be up there preaching the word at one of the boot camps just like us. So I'm excited that you're willing to share it, and I will be nice, I promise. So maybe for the listeners, why don't you just give us a little bit of a background on, how did you become an entrepreneur? Was it accidental? Did you just, was it intentional? What was the kind of the catalyst? And then kind of maybe do a Cliff Note version of how you got to where you're at today.
Oh, wow. That's a lot. So feel free to cut me off if I start rambling too much.
I will.
So how I got started, was it accidental or intentional? I'd say it was both. My first opportunity out of college was working in the insurance and financial services field. So it was full commission, but with a well-respected organization. So there I kind of got the flavor for being an entrepreneur, because you work independently in a collaborative environment. And then, I made a contact, which ultimately led to me starting Home Care by Blackstone with my two partners, Phil Black and Steve Stone. So, I had that first experience out of college that kind of gave me the flavor, I guess, for being an entrepreneur. And I knew from then that I always wanted to have, the opportunity that an entrepreneur has, but also kind of the avoidance of, I guess, bureaucracy that comes with large organizations, chart my own path, but also to make a difference in the community, be in a field where there was what they referred to in the financial services organization as a psychic income. So I didn't want to just build widgets. So it was kind of three things, where do I have an unlimited opportunity? Where can I add, value to the community and have freedom and flexibility? So started in the insurance field. A few years later, my friend contacted me about this opportunity where he was buying a franchise, and it evolved over 20 years.
So why don't you give the audience a little bit of a rundown of what the business was that you were doing?
Sure. So we were home health care, and we were diversified. We did, at the time we exited in November of 2015, it was about a $50 million business. We had 2,000 employees at that time. And we were about 60% what they would call personal care or long-term care in home, basically home health aides helping seniors primarily with daily living activities. And then 40% of our business was primarily skilled in-home care, nurses, therapists. And we had a tiny division that's less than 1%, maybe 1% of our business was primary care at the time we exited. We had nurse practitioners actually doing primary care in the home as well. So that's what we looked like at the end. At the beginning, I mentioned earlier, we were a franchise. One of my partners had been a franchise owner in the pharmacy industry and had done quite well. The other partner was a pharma rep. So they had the vision of starting a home health care business and having some synergy between home health care and the pharmacy business. And
interesting, yeah.
Yeah, the commonality, the one gentleman decided, the two of them were going to do this separate from me before I was even in the conversation. And then one of them got cold feet because his current career was presenting some good opportunities. So he decided to stay there. And then the other gentleman who knew me said, well, let's talk to this young guy who doesn't know any better and see if we can get him to do it.
He's going to work really hard. Yeah. He's going to ask very little equity. Like it's just going to be perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So in a handshake in early in 96, I said, if I do good, I could get some equity, some sweat equity along the way. And that was the vision. They pitched me on buying in this franchise or starting a franchise. In May of 96, we launched with 2 employees. And like I said, 19 and a half years later, we sold it with 2,000.
And you and I, because I know some background of the story, so I'm going to try and take it in sequential order. Because I think, David, some of the main points that maybe I'll kind of just set some groundwork here, and then we can kind of ebb and flow is, you struggling with growth and how growth is expensive. I want to make sure that we touch on that because you grew so fast. And then the different kind of exits, you had different partners and capital structures, and just, you got so many different angles that you went through. So maybe let's start with, okay, you got 2 employees and now you're the young gun with energy. How did you grow? And maybe give us some of the milestones and some of the challenges with the growth that you had.
Sure. Again, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of the early years because they were so challenging. As a
I'll help,
side,
don't worry.
yeah. As a side note, and I think any entrepreneur listening to this can relate. I heard this from somebody I met probably a year and a half ago who was an entrepreneur. He built a similar but different business. He referred to the early years as dog years. I'm like, yes, that's exactly what they're like. Every year it feels like 7 years, and when you get to be my age, it's like,
got
God,
it.
I don't want to do that again. But the franchisor eventually went out of business, and there was just a lot of debacle and craziness in the first 3 years. The franchisor changed hands multiple times. The Balanced Budget Act had passed. We thought we were going to become a Medicare provider out of the gate. That totally changed our plan. We said, okay, my partners at that point had invested capital in the business. We were barely breaking even, and they're kind of like, well, you need to figure out how to make this work without Medicare. So what are you going to do? By the way, the franchisor had cash flow problems. So as the process of going from a franchisee to an independent, we had to find a new capital structure. So we ended up working with a factoring company in those early years to get by. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when I said that at lunch, we were factoring, and I think we both about threw up on our table.
Outrageously expensive, but I mean, it was a valuable resource. I mean, if we didn't have it at that time, we may have closed the doors. And
can you explain? I don't know how much of that story you can explain, but I think it's very interesting because, I just got done with a trip with 50 entrepreneurs that are younger, and a lot of them are hitting the Inc. 5000, and growth is expensive, and it eats up cash, and I don't know if you can shed some of the light on what you did with the factoring and how you were able to buy it out. If not, we can just keep moving.
Yeah, I mean, and later in the business, the expensive growth was really exaggerated as we were doing acquisitions and growing organically, and we were experiencing 30% growth. But in that instance, I'll elaborate a little bit. It's been a while that I can tell you what I recall. I mean, in short, there was cash flow problems in the franchisor relationship, but we had a nice AR, they call it $500,000, and the factoring company was willing to lend just on your AR, so they would loan us $400,000. And since the franchisor was looking to exit the franchisee business, they basically wanted, a financial compensation for the franchisees to be able to exit. So I went to the factoring company, got some capital, went to the franchisor, negotiated our freedom, and we were loose. And then it was a matter of okay, now what do we do? So we had to build our whole infrastructure of, how are we going to do payroll and invoicing and policies and procedures, insurance. So the following year was really just about infrastructure and kind of stabilizing the business. And, the factoring company provided immediate cash each and every week. We just said, hey, here's what we billed last week. And then they would fund us a percentage of that. And then we would have to go collect it, and they would take it back within 90 days if we didn't get the money. It was really, really high interest, but for a company that was on the brink, it was, huge.
Yeah, I will just put an exclamation point off of that last sentence because that was us. I always said, if you need help with your AP and your AR, man, I'm your guy.
But yeah, you just gotta have it. we probably stayed on it too long. We probably should have been more financially disciplined.
How long were you on it?
Oh God, good question. At least 3 years.
So we're on it for 13.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. Stupid.
Yeah.
So on that question, David, how did you get out? It's two questions, I think probably different parts of the sandwich here. One is what was fueling your growth to grow that fast? And then how did you get off of it? And then what was the next kind of pivotal point on restructuring your capital?
So by 2001, we were $3 million in revenue, and we were mixed between the personal care, home care, and temporary medical staffing, which, if you recall, that wasn't part of our service line when we sold. So we were 50-50 between staffing and personal care, home care. And at that point, we made it 5 years in business. Now we're an independent. We rebuilt our infrastructure. We were still in the factoring company. And so we sat down and said, okay, we made it 5 years. Let's do our first strategic plan. And what do we want to do over the next, 3 to 5 years? And we agreed that our passion was home care. We weren't really excited about the staffing business. So we agreed not to exit the staffing business, not to shut it down, but just to really put our energy in growing home care.
How'd you guys determine that?
It probably wasn't rocket science. Well, I know it wasn't rocket science. It was more looking at a little bit of a SWOT analysis in the 2001, but the SWOT analysis really just confirmed because my two partners participated in this strategic planning, but they weren't active in the business. And then I had myself and I think just one of our key employees. And during that time period when the Balanced Budget Act had changed our focus from growing a Medicare business to just surviving and focusing on the core business we had, we did good and kind of grew the staffing business and grew the personal care. So we're kind of like growing both service lines from 99 to 2001. We get to that point where now we're independent. It's like, okay, we got to stable a business. What do we do? So we bring in the key manager, a couple partners, go off site, hire a facilitator, and have the discussion, do the SWOT analysis. And we're like, all right, well, when the staffing business is, the nice thing about it is you can generate some quick revenue. The difficult thing is it's very price sensitive, marketing intensive. And, we were okay. There were competitors that were bigger and just, probably better than us. And the customers weren't necessarily loyal because it was so price sensitive, and the staff wasn't as loyal either. But the home care just had more of a nurturing, a good feel to it. You're helping seniors age in place. The staff would come to home care knowing that they could actually make more money working in hospitals or nursing home, but they wanted to do home care because they enjoyed one-on-one care. So, home care was a feel-good story. So we're like, all right, we enjoy the business. And actually our biggest customer at the time paid us once a month, every month on time. Whereas that as opposed to the staffing business where I had to do a lot of collection work. So yeah,
that makes sense. So what fueled the growth? Because I know there was a couple different points where you were like, restructuring the capital, which I think it's just the reason I'm emphasizing both the growth and the capital is because I think that's where so many people blindly, David, like just to kind of set some foundation here, blindly just accept like, oh, I need private equity or I need VC or someone else that I know has an investor, and they give away tranches of their company because they don't understand the options. So like, what was fueling the growth, and then kind of the back behind the scenes?
All right. So I'll kind of accelerate the story. So we're at 01, $3 million in revenue, kind of develop our focus of growing the home care, and made another good hire the following year, somebody who actually had a good experience in the skilled home care business, but she was overseeing the non-skilled side. And we started to expand geographically. We moved from just Dayton, Ohio down to Cincinnati. And one of our major customers added a new service line. We helped them we were very active politically, advocating for funding for senior services. So a new program expanded that helped. So we had geographic expansion. We had a new service line in our core business. And then we had also had this key hire who helped us eventually get into the Medicare program. So from 01 to 04, our business mix changed from 50-50 staffing home care to 100% home care. And then in 04, we added the Medicare line. So then from 04 to 07, now we're 3 million. And then we just grew organically by having the two service lines and being in two markets and providing good customer service. And we went from, call it 3 million to 10 million by the end of 07.
So on that note, I'm just curious, when you say organically, what was there, because I got a friend that's in the similar space and he's probably listening to this. And sometimes it drives me nuts on how fast he gets leads. And so like, where were you getting these? Was it from hospitals or like where, like when you say organically, did you have salespeople? What was the revenue generating machine that you had?
Yeah, we had a little bit of a unique niche on the personal care side. And I'll keep this simple because your audience probably isn't here just to learn about home care, but there's basically companies that market for what we call private pay within the industry. So for seniors that are paying out of pocket for their services. So there's a huge niche there. And we were okay in that market, but our sweet spot was really some of the Medicaid long-term care subsidized programs, whether it was the state of Ohio, federal Medicaid waiver, VA program. So we were kind of good in those subsidized programs. So typically we worked with a group called the Area Agency on Aging. There was 12 of them in Ohio. So those were part of our big referral source. And those helped with the long-term care, personal care side of home care. And then those patients also needed the skilled care. And our competition was really good with their sales teams and going to hospitals and going to physicians and nursing homes and capturing the referrals from a pure sales perspective from discharge planners and social workers. So by the time we got Medicare certified, the Medicare program had changed in 01 and it had stabilized in 04, but we were kind of already behind the eight ball because everybody had these sales forces that were going after the referral sources. So rather than saying we're going to try to compete in what what we called the bloody ocean. We're like, the blue ocean for us is just capturing the skilled care for our own patients. Let's just do that. So we hired a social worker, and we called her community liaison, and her focus was making sure that when our patients needed skilled care, we were their provider. So that proved to be our hedgehog, if you want to quote Jim Collins. I mean, everybody was going after either the private pay and on the personal care side, because it had higher margins, or they had a sales team going after the skilled because it had good margins. And we took the low margin but steady cash flow Medicaid business and then coordinated their care with the skilled care. And it was an area that we didn't have a lot of competition. So we were very successful in the Dayton market, and then took the business to Cincinnati and just kept going with it.
Well, I think it's a really important note that you make there, because I think there's some good points in there, because, especially like when you're looking at your competition, and a lot of people do what everybody else is doing. And you mentioned before strategic planning, and I know you're a big EOS advocate as well. And I talk about that a lot. And I think what you guys, came up with, the Blue Ocean, which is a fantastic book. And there's just like really thinking about it intentionally. Where do you want to put your effort and energy versus just, because you could have just, done what everybody else did and then woke up, 4 years later and been, just beating the crap out of each other and having no future value. Yep. So, I think it's just important that you guys intentionally did that.
Well, let me get back to your capital point too, because so during that time period where we kind of took off from 2003 through the end of 2007, and we had somewhere early in that time period, we did manage to go to a traditional bank for financing and bought out our debt from the factoring company. So we were free of the high interest. We had personal guarantees, and we're with a local bank, and feeling good, and the business is growing. But to your point about the growth being expensive, now we're growing organically from 3 to 10 million of revenue. But because that's pretty good growth, and revenue's growing, profit's growing, but we made the mistake that a lot of entrepreneurs make, and distributions grew proportionally as well. Hence, we never really paid down the debt too successfully. So here we are at 2007, having now hit the 10 million threshold, and we still had some debt on the books, which was a shame. And I won't spare you the details, but we ended up doing an acquisition in 2007 by accident. It was just a small one in the Cincinnati market that the opportunity just came up by almost accident. We weren't looking for it. They weren't looking to sell. It was a business that was closing, and we just kind of bought the remaining assets, which was a small caregiver base and the patient base. But that fit so well, it made me realize, wow, that fits into our model so good. We should just do a lot more of these. And so my wheels started turning, and I'm just like, man, if we didn't have this debt on our balance sheet, we could grow faster. And I got an introduction to a gentleman who had a history of introducing people who had capital and people who needed capital. And so we ended up at the end of 2007, January 1 of 2008, bringing in minority capital and sold 12% of the business. And we used that to pay off the debt, and it left a little bit of dry powder in the business that we could go after further acquisitions. And then over the next 3 years, we had more discipline on the distributions, but we went, we basically went from 10 million to 25 million over the next 3 years. So wow. It was, really good growth.
So, a couple questions on that then. So, when you look at the 12% minority capital partners, so I think there's a huge spectrum of when people bring partners in, they do this with hopes. Honestly, my dad did this when he grew, which very interesting parallel stories, because when this is before I was in the business, but when the Minnesota Post Office, the United States Post Office, so grew from like 2 million to like 7 million. And I had to get on factoring because of that. And then brought on a minority partner, but that minority partner brought in some capital and then never contributed ever again. So the whole point of doing that was just null and void. So maybe explain, what was there terms, conditions, what was the, understanding? Cause I'm assuming your working capital was growing as you were growing, your AP and AR were growing. So how did the discussions take place, and what was the assumption of 12% gets you obviously 12% of the business, and you have to buy in for that to help pay off the debt, but then what came with that from their strategic influence?
Yeah. Other than, giving up 12% of the equity and 12% of the more S corps or 12% of any distributions. We structured it really simple. We didn't have like different types of shares or anything. They were just a fellow shareholder, and we gave up because it ended up being, I think, a total of 6 individuals. But that one individual who did the fundraising it's more like a friends and family. This wasn't a professional private equity, but the one guy corralled 6 investors. They came up with the money, and we gave him a board seat. So it was me, my 2 founding partners, and then this one new gentleman.
Okay. So then going from 10 to 25 million, and you don't have to give too much color on this, but I think when we talked about it in the boot camp is there's this whole phrase that we like to bring up of solving for annual income versus solving for value creation. So now that you have a new partner and you've got a strategic plan, you're growing like crazy. Was there any kind of like shift in your mindset, David, of like, okay, at some point this is going to be worth something, right? I mean, and then how were you balancing the annual income, so the salaries plus distributions versus and debt versus creating something that you could have options and sell at some point? Like I think you'd explain that there's conflict there for everybody that owns a company.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was probably further complicated in our field because of the Affordable Care Act that passed in 2010. So yes, I mean, my goal had always been to get to 10 million at one point. Like, and then when we did that first strategic plan in 2001, I was like, man, that'd be amazing if we could be 10 million in revenue by 2010. And then here we are in 2010 at 25 million in revenue. So we far exceeded, where I thought we could take the business already. And one of the experiences I had early in my career, and when I said I worked in the insurance and financial services, and also just life experiences growing up in a small town, I had learned from some professionals and business owners who had good runs in whatever they were doing, whatever their career was. And, the fundamental principle, buy low, sell high, should be true to business owners and entrepreneurs, not just your money in the stock market. And I saw people who didn't realize that and held on to their businesses too long. And then, it maybe peaked. And then, here they are looking to retire and they can't exit their business and they're stuck with it and succession planning. So on one hand, I knew not to get too emotionally attached and that at some point, you have to exercise those, that opportunity when it comes your way. So I was always mindful of that. I mean, my degree was in finance, right? So in between life experiences and my education, I just kind of understood that. And then here we'd had this growth opportunity. But, in 2010, I was only 40. And so I was like, well, certainly wasn't even thinking. Now, opportunities did present themselves over the years. I should back up. One time a strategic buyer approached us in 2007. And I had just met with a broker, ironically, like 3 to 6 months before we were approached by the strategic buyer. And I told the broker what my vision was, how I wanted to get to 20 million or whatever it was at that time. I think at 2007 or 8, we had done our second strategic plan, and I was coming out of that full of energy. So I told this broker, we're not interested. He was just out relationship building. Fast forward, I got that strategic buyer approaching me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, somebody actually thinks our business is worth this. I could exit. I could take that much off the table and then have a partner, and then there's potentially referrals. They want me to be the president of a division. So it kind of planted a seed in my head. And then I ran into this broker at a conference, and I told him that I had just been approached by a strategic buyer. And he's like, well, what are you thinking? That's not consistent with your goals that you just shared with me a few months ago. And it was like somebody just threw cold water in my face. I'm like, you're right. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to go to work for somebody else at this point. So that was a great experience because it kind of helped me, consistent with what I heard at your guys' boot camp, and you guys help entrepreneurs really understand their drivers. So even though I realized it was really interesting that we were building a business that had some nice economic value, my drivers were those things I had said earlier. I want freedom and independence. I like the opportunity to make an income, but I also want to make a difference in my community. Really don't like bureaucracy and inefficiencies. So I was like, yeah, I just, buckled down. We executed the plan. But then, the curveball, it's going to be unique, I think, for our story compared to some of your other podcasts is that, being in the healthcare field, the Affordable Care Act, somebody used an analogy of a hurricane. And I think that is spot on because, they compared the ACA to a hurricane because, like they said, if you think of a tornado, if you live in the Midwest, they come up out of the blue, horrific damage overnight, and you never see them coming. Hurricanes, on the other hand, you see it out on the coast. You're watching it a week in advance on the radar. You're wondering, is it going to hit, Florida? Is it going to go up to Georgia, the Carolinas? So you're always kind of watching it. And that's kind of what the ACA was to healthcare when it was passed. Everybody's like, oh gosh, there's all these new regulations, changes in reimbursement, new payment models. What's this going to do? Regulations. But things were implemented so slowly, and over the years, it was just kind of like, man,
molasses. You couldn't figure out what business model you wanted to be in.
Exactly. But you knew you had to shift from volume to value. That was the whole emphasis on healthcare. We got to be a value-based provider. So at that 25 million level that we reached in 2010, I was kind of still committed for the long term, but realized now the business was even significantly more valuable than it was just 3 years earlier. In our little simple formula, we estimated we tripled the value. So initially we did a capital raise back in 2007 to get that growth capital. Now we went ahead, me and one partner wanted to take some more chips off the table since we had increased the value. So we did that. But again, it wasn't to grow the business. It was just more of a diversification of our assets because like most entrepreneurs, our net worth was tied up in the business. So we went to the same individual that had brought in the minority capital before. He went back to his network and raised some other capital to help us take some chips off the table. So that was right before all the headwinds started to come with the ACA. Managed Medicare went from our main payer source on our high margin business, and then insurance companies started to get more market share in the Medicare Advantage space, and that changed things significantly. So we had that going on, and then Ohio had a budget deficit. There's rumors about rate cuts for the Medicaid program, and that created a lot of fear. And at one point, we continued to do acquisitions along this run, and by the time we exited, I think I told you we overall did 14 different acquisitions. Some were great, very synergistic, and a couple we probably shouldn't have done. We did asset purchases, we did stock purchases, we expanded geographically, we did tuck-in acquisitions. But in this period of the ACA, when Ohio was going through a budget cut, we acquired one of our largest competitors on the personal care side. And that was our biggest acquisition to date. We did traditional bank financing, had a great relationship with our bank. And then that helped us kind of get through the tough times that Ohio was going through with some of the rate cuts. We picked up some more volume in our low margin business, and it helped offset the rate cuts.
So I want to go back, David, to the, it's such an interesting dynamic because it's business, right? You have this hurricane potentially brewing, which, right now, you name an industry, they've got either China issues or they've got technology issues or employment issues. It's all different things. Yep. Yours was very visible. But you're also trying to maintain your growth, right? Because you can't just stop. And so, obviously at 14 acquisitions and raising another round, you were very bullish, but also very cautious. So curious on that round, how much did you sell of the business that time?
Good question. It was 6%.
Okay. So then, as you were going through, I'm just curious with these acquisitions, going through the boot camp again, whether people are buying or planning on selling. It's applicable to both. And you were kind of sharing some stories about some of the sellers that you had sat across from. What are a couple highlights or big learning lessons that you had from people that you were buying? Because I think what's interesting is that you, as a buyer, were sometimes strategic, sometimes financial. So you played a bunch of different roles, and the deal structures were widely different between all of them. So maybe, I don't know if there's a couple main highlights that you can say, hey, this is what we learned that also helped you as you prepped and sold your company.
Sure. Yeah. One of the, I think a lot of us who are passionate about business like reading good business books. And I'd read some Jack Welch's stuff early on, and there's a line that resonated with me. And he talked, this is before I think we ever did an acquisition, but he said, there's no such things as mergers. You get acquirers and acquirees. And that, his purpose in saying that is most mergers fail because people don't approach it with that attitude. You have to have, a game plan on how to integrate the business that you're acquiring. And, so I think when I look back at, our track record, that's spot on. The ones that went really well were small tuck-in acquisitions that were in our market where we were able to integrate them into our businesses immediately. And they provided, synergy from day one. And then Others we did that provided less synergy, but were more strategic. Like when we expanded to a new market, we would look at what kind of talent is it going to bring us. So, if we were going to bring, new customer base, new administrative talent, those were good things. So when we went to Columbus, we picked up both of those things, that we got some business development talent and a new niche. So that was a smart one. But ones that didn't go so good were really integration issues. And two examples would be, one was in Southwest Ohio. And even though typically when I was working with another entrepreneur, I would share with them the Jack Welch line, acquire or an acquiree, and it's going to be our way. And especially when I acquired our biggest competitor in this market, they understood the strategy and they supported it, and that's why it worked out really well. And that was like $5 or $6 million acquisition. The one that didn't go so well was like less than $1 million acquisition, but it was from an organization who it's kind of complicated, but I can't say they were always on board with selling, but it was a good strategic buy for us, I thought. Mm-hmm. Long story short, it took about 6 months from the time they announced it to their employees for the time we bought it. So we ended up buying the business and being responsible for the patients, but we lost a lot of the staff during that transition because it wasn't handled well from the seller side. So, the integration plan has got to be, you announce it and then you start integrating. in our line, where it's a service industry, you can't have that much uncertainty out there. So that was a huge mistake. The second kind of mistake on an acquisition would have been on the IT side. We did another acquisition where we didn't integrate their patients into our system right away. And the challenge with that was it was the largest acquisition we had done, and we are now inheriting their computer system, which didn't interface well. It turned out it had some revenue recognition issues, which just created a lot of challenge and distraction with our bank and so forth. So both, local market acquisitions where you're grabbing market share for us were fantastic. Working with the sellers to understand that we're the acquirer and they're the acquiree, picking up good talent and new niches that you can fit into your business model were good. Controlling the timeline and technology were the two mistakes.
Oh, that's interesting. Controlling on the technology too. I'm sorry to cut you off, but so your question was, yep. When I was selling, yep. Those were things I remembered, going into the process on the other side. Which is interesting too, because I was interviewing a guy about integration after the fact and how challenging that can be, because he goes, there's things that you will not figure out until after the fact. And I'm like, yeah, that's the truth. So then, David, you'd shared some stories about the distributions versus investing. And I think that this is a challenge for every business owner, right? So you're going to have distributions, which is nice because, I think so many entrepreneurs sacrifice lifestyle for long periods of time to get their business off the ground to the point where they actually have a distribution. So then there becomes this, okay, I like it, I definitely deserve it, which, by the way, I do believe that people deserve it, and it's their choice on whether they want to take the distribution or not. However, there's a give or take, right? Because by investing back into the business, you're investing in acquisitions or value creating, which we talk about a lot, which is what private equity firms do all day long, right? Because they're concerned about the value in the back end, not the lifestyle in the annual 12-month period. So especially as if you've got investors and you've got different people and you've got different ages, I think ages also brings a different dynamic. And this is name a business. I think they go through this challenge. So what were the conversations like that you were having and having to balance between distributions and reinvesting in the company, especially as you've got headwinds coming at you?
Yeah, that's a good segue to the sale too, because so we had been heavily a lifestyle investment early on. We brought into minority capital and we became more financially disciplined, but still somewhat of a lifestyle. We went from maybe being an income investment to a growth and income investment. So now we were still kicking out distributions, but we were still growing. So in the early days, we were just, once we got profitable and we were no longer a franchise, the revenue was relatively flat. We got profitable, we had distributions. And then we brought in that capital. We started executing the growth from 10 million to 25. We were able to do some modest distributions and execute the growth strategy. And then the headwinds started to come in. And then, when we did that second round and brought in some strategic partners as well, we had then another board member. So we created an environment where some distributions were expected. So that was an investor expectation that we had to meet, as well as kind of the lifestyle for some of the shareholders. So it was balancing, whether they're individual shareholders or strategic investors that had bought into our business. Now I had a much more, by 2012, 2014, complicated investor, shareholder, partner base that wanted
a lot of people.
Yeah,
people involved.
So, yep. So we're dealing with the headwinds, and they had, I guess, take away the ACA, they had reasonable expectations on distributions, but then all the challenges. At the point, I was thinking we really need to and make an investment in one of our new service lines. We had acquired that primary care business. I wanted to invest in that further because I recognized our new customers, the managed care companies, really found that to be an attractive service line. It was creating a lot of opportunities for us that we hadn't had before with managed care. So I wanted to invest in the new service line that was struggling, that was strategically important to the business. I wanted to get new technology because we had various clinical platforms. I wanted an integrated one, and I wanted to continue to do acquisitions. So I felt we needed to really shift from being a growth and income investment to strictly growth. I said, the ACA is going to be crazy. Let's just focus on growth, scale back distributions to its only tax. And everybody was kind of like, well, we get the strategy, but maybe you can, find a balance between just keeping them
maybe
flat.
You can keep doing the distributions.
Yeah, right. Just keep them flat. Just don't grow them. I'm like, all right, well, at the same time, we had, reached, this is now 2014. I'm like, we'd reached a pretty good value compared to what we were seeing in the marketplace on multiples. I'm like, what if I can get, and I had heard a story too of companies in our field that had sold to private equity, where basically the management team and the CEO would partner with the private equity group, take some chips off the table, and then roll their equity forward with a new opportunity. And that sounded intriguing to me, similar to the strategic buyer that approached me in 2007. But instead of a strategic buyer coming in and telling me what to do, the private equity concept that I heard was going to be, hey, we're going to invest in you and your team and your vision, and we'll, buy out the shareholders, so forth. I'm like, all right, this is interesting because, we're doing all this innovative stuff and trying to serve new customers in managed care and being a value-based provider. This is an interesting opportunity. Let's explore what this looks like. So then hired an investment bank to represent us, and we didn't. So we had learned kind of the difference between a broker and an investment bank over the years, and brokers are good for certain size companies. We'd grown to the point where we could, warrant an investment bank. The bank we chose had a lot of good connections in the home care arena, and we didn't want an auction. We wanted to be very private because if we didn't hit our number, we weren't going to sell. So we talked to 7 groups, got 6 offers, and then we kind of did diligence on the 3 that were the highest, and chose one. And long story short, the diligence process kind of beat us up. And then we pivoted from there and went to the one who finished at second place and said, okay, well, we like you too. And they actually ended up, buying the diligence material from the other one.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And so then we spent another few months for them. Then they found different reasons in the first group to drive down the value. So I learned, I'm like, all right, well, the value in the LOI is kind of what we wanted, but the post diligence is really what we're worth. So, and we had been distracted from the business because we had done the large acquisition that had the IT challenges. And now because we had the roadshow of talking, to all the private equity groups and then diligence with 2 of them, is almost a year of distractions. So it's kind of like, I got to just get off this merry-go-round. We're hurting the business by being distracted. We had some bad debt issues develop over that period. So I kind of walked away from the private equity opportunity in February of 15.
I mean, and I know you probably summed up, I'll take one of your comments earlier. I'm assuming that 12 months was kind of like in dog years. 7 years in 1 year, because
it's more like a boxer.
Well, and you would
think of those Rocky Balboa movies where he and the Apollo Creed go 15 rounds. It felt more like that.
Well, because you had mentioned, we talked in the boot camp about due diligence and your, the challenges going through due diligence and how much they were pushing down the price and for various reasons. And I just think it's, you mentioned a lot of the good important things because so many times, it's a second job. Literally, It's a second job doing what you're doing while you're trying to keep the company, at the current growth rate. So, it's super challenging. And then, I don't know if you have any kind of note, because I tell the listeners or the people in the boot camp or anybody I talk to that if you've seen one private equity firm, you've seen one private equity firm because of how different they are. I don't know if you got any comments on like strategies or like how their approaches were or what they wanted with the business.
That's a good question. I would agree with your statement. I mean, if you've seen one, because there's a lot of differences. We were close to that 50 million in revenue threshold as we were talking to them that year. And one of the only group that didn't give us a bid said we were too small. They were, focused on bigger investments. That was interesting to me, but consistent with what the investment banker had shared. And I think that's one thing I'd go back to is it's really important to get a good investment bank who knows your industry, has connections, can help you get prepared in ways you didn't know you needed to be prepared. I learned all kinds of stuff in that cycle. But as far as the private equity groups themselves, in our experience, we learned about family offices, where they get their money from, and, how they're structured, what incentives they were going to provide for the management team. I'm thinking we had one that was a nonprofit private equity group, or that's where their money came from a foundation. We had a family office, and we also had a traditional American institutions, and we had one that had money from international. So, a wide flavor of groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So why don't you explain that after you got recalibrated again? Because I don't know how much time we got.
Yeah, I haven't got to the sale yet. Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't you kind of give some of the main highlights? Because I think, and then even afterwards and some of the challenges that you went through.
Yeah, so we ended up selling to Almost Family, a publicly traded home care company out of Louisville. And I'd gotten to know and respect their CEO, William Yarmouth. They, from a distance, they had built, William was an entrepreneur who started that company. And before they acquired us, I believe they were in the neighborhood of 550 million in revenue. What I knew from the distance was that they had a diversified business, similar to ours. They did personal care and home health. They had done an acquisition into, I don't remember the exact name, what they called it, but they were trying to be innovative, similar to us. And I'm like, okay, I like the fact that they're being innovative. They got this innovation arm. They're diversified. And then William was very politically active. He'd been a big industry advocate when it came to the Affordable Care Act. And then in Ohio, we worked together on a couple initiatives. In fact, we were kind of the co-government affairs committee, whatever award we got in, I think 2014 or 15. So he had approached me previously about their buying us, and I wasn't interested in going to a strategic. And then, post the private equity conversations, he approached me again, and I just opened up and was candid with him and said where we were at, and kind of threw out a number where it would take, just to say basically, we're not interested right now. It was my message, but then he didn't back off. He said, "No, I think you guys are a good fit. You'd be a good leader. You could be my Ohio guy." So, I had made some personnel changes, and so we felt like it was a good time to have that conversation based upon the valuation he was considering. And 6 months later, I was working for him. So it went pretty quick. And then we were excited about, taking our business model and bringing it to the strategic buyer, which was Almost Family, and roll that model out across Ohio. The challenge was, I think when you go with a strategic and you are demanding your price like we did, then you got to deliver quick. So I think, that's what I like about your boot camp. I think you guys did a good job helping entrepreneurs understand what are your drivers and what the different buyer types look like. Because it makes complete sense, in retrospect. But as you're going through it, we were 6 or 9 months into the acquisition, and I inherited their group in Ohio. Once we started having to make some tough personnel decisions, we knew there was going to be synergies, right? I mean, we expect that when there's an acquisition. We'd been on the other side and had done a lot of that over the years. And so we anticipated it, but it was just kind of I guess I would say maybe abruptness and the quarterly pressure that was a little bit of a stunner. And then the technology, we were trying to build out a new technology platform. We had to challenge that, and we had to go on their legacy platform. So there were some things that just kind of, it was really, they did a lot of things great, way better than us. But at the same time, as the entrepreneur who's used to kind of a certain culture, trying to integrate that culture. Because again, now I had been the acquirer many times. Now I was the acquiree. I found myself trying to be the culture, guy, trying to keep the morale up. And it was difficult.
Well, and I think in that note, one major thing that we talk about in the boot camp, or like anybody that's thinking about this, and the fact that you already acquired 14 companies, so like you were no amateur to this, and you still, like, even to go back to Jack Welch's comment, is there is no merger,
Yep.
is especially in strategics versus private equity, because private equity needs to make a return on the investment. There is strategic purposes behind some roll ups, but like in the
Absolutely.
strategic, there's certain things that they're going to want to do with your business, and it just takes, I don't know if you'll ever fully understand their side of what they plan to do with your company, because it's no longer yours, right?
Correct.
And especially the fact that it was a public company, so it's, I mean, I don't know, was there anything, you had mentioned, so there's the intention of what's going to happen afterwards because of what they've said, why they want to buy you. But what were some of the challenges? I think you had mentioned like their performa was relying, because it's a public company, right? So like their performa was relying on some of the things that you guys were talking about, and like just explain maybe kind of the integration and like how the intentions might have been off from what reality was.
That could take us another hour. So I'm just going to give you a real simple, high level answer. I mean, I think, we had done a pro forma of what the merged businesses would look like in Ohio, and delivered that product and said, here's what I think I can do, if I'm, the division. And then I think that was like, okay, great. If we can do that, then we can justify, paying this price and bring that asset in. But I don't think we really discussed when we could do it. To me, it probably would have been a 3-year project, but I think we needed to deliver those results quicker. So I think when you're not delivering the synergistic growth that you expect quick enough to justify the value that you got, then you have to go look at the cost side. So, ultimately it's a formula, and you got to deliver to your shareholders. And if we weren't getting the top line growth, in fact, if we were going the other direction, then you got to make some tough decisions. And that was probably part of the complication that I understood, but it just was a whirlwind that I wasn't used to. And, my team certainly wasn't used to.
And I think there's this whole balance of like you guys are playing the long game, value creation, but then all of a sudden you have 90-day gates that you have to hit. I mean, was there an interesting dynamic of all of a sudden seeing how short-sighted public companies are?
For sure. For sure. So, let me kind of accelerate the story too, then, because I spent 3.5 years within the public environment. And then what I did learn, it was to your point about the strategic nature. They had acquired us, and then they'd acquired a few companies before us. They'd acquired a company in New York, and then a big company down south. And so they were really doing, even as a public company, a pretty significant roll up. And then they did a large joint venture. And then all of a sudden, almost family, two years into the acquisition, they were acquired by LHC Group. So that was announced as a merger with LHC, and it took a few months for that to integrate. I had a 3-year commitment with my contract. Again, just kind of another consideration for an entrepreneur when you're selling. I had a 3-year employment agreement with Almost Family, but then when LHC came on board, I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. New organization, new strategy. So ended up staying 3.5 years total post sale. I moved into a new role with LHC, but then we kind of mutually agreed last year it was time to move on. So since then I've been out on my own. But then it was amazing though, because when those two companies came together, at first I was like, why are those two public companies merging? But then as I understood their strategy, I'm like, well, it makes total sense, based upon the geographic coverage they have, complementary service lines. And from a shareholder, because I had rolled some stock into it, they've done fantastic. So it's those things as an entrepreneur. I mean, I think all those options are good options. Like you said earlier, it's just business. I mean, and you really got to get your head around. And even though I said I had separated, kind of the emotion from the business, you can't do that entirely. But understanding and far enough in advance, and then making a plan. What are your drivers? Like you guys educate, and then what are those options, and understand the pros and cons of each. It's just infinitely valuable.
Well, and the point that you made, because I think you said that you were trying to make it just financial because it's just business, but then you had realized that it is emotional too, especially if you're dealing with employee and turnover and stuff like that. How do you is there a way to reconcile those two? I mean, like if there's anything that you would suggest for someone that wants to optimize both of those, how would what feedback would you give?
That's tough. I mean, I think, I think in some ways we did do that, whether it's incentives for your team through a deal, negotiate post deal. If you're selling, have the wherewithal to set aside severance dollars. We did that. The buyer actually had severance as well. So some of the employees got really good severances. So, and then you got to look at you getting alignment, especially if you're an organization that has multiple partners, is key, and doing it early is key. And that's probably one of the areas. I mean, again, I said it a few times. The ACA certainly created unique challenges for our field.
As you had, talked about it, that you were really financially, like the goal is that you were to try and keep it separate because business is business. But then over the course of, acquiring 14 companies and working with your employees, and also I know you and you're a good individual, is, it's hard to separate the emotion and the financials, and how to, if there's any kind of feedback or one takeaway, the last takeaway of how to balance both the financials, but then also your personal drivers how do you balance that, and what suggestions would you have for someone that hasn't gone through this yet?
How you balance it? I mean, getting the right advisors and making sure you vet all the different options and understand there's pros and cons with each. The private equity was attractive, and I know some people who have done fantastic with private equity. So even though the diligence experience was tough on me, I know of two people who have just done phenomenal. They had a clear strategy. They invested some capital, co-invested with the private equity group, and they hit not even a home run, but grand slams. So, I mean, PE can be a wonderful partner, and strategic buyers can be great too. I mean, especially, with the ACA, everybody's looking at a clinical integrated network. Insurance companies are buying providers. Providers are becoming insurance companies. So strategic sales made a ton of sense in healthcare. So it's really just trying to build alignment with all your stakeholders, right? Stakeholders are your employees, as well as your owners and equity team, but also your advisors. And, having a group like you who can educate people of everything is nice. Because, we had some great advisors in all the different times. I think for most of the decisions I made, given the cards I had at the time, we probably made the right decision. But, more education, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe things would have been different. But it's so hard to play Monday morning quarterback because, you can only play with the cards you're dealt any given hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, the key is, education and alignment with stakeholders.
So if there's someone, why don't you give the listeners a little bit of an overview of what you're doing now? Because I think you're also helping people get what they want as well, on the numbers and some of the US material and the different things you're doing now. And what's the best place to get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. I've joined an organization called Focus CFO. So what we do is work with small and medium-sized businesses. Everything from pre-revenue to 100 million, but our sweet spot's kind of like the 2 to 20 million. So most companies that can't afford or don't need a full-time CFO, we provide that service on a fractional basis. So it's fantastic because, as we were going through the growth challenges, there's so many mistakes and successes we had along the way. So now what I'm able to do is, help other entrepreneurs by sharing my experiences and provide them with experienced CFOs on a part-time basis who can help them plan for the future. So I'm excited to be part of this group and hopefully help others from some of my experiences and with better tools that we didn't know that were out there.
What's the best place to get in touch with you?
You can email me at Tramontana, that's TRA Montana, at focuscfo.com.
David, thanks so much for coming on the show, and I enjoy it, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Ryan.